right, let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. Amir Weiner, Director of the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies. And for those of you who did not come yesterday to the brilliant lecture by our distinguished guest today, Sir Lawrence Freedman, Professor Emeritus from King's College in War Studies. As we said, introduced yesterday, Professor Freedman is an eminent authority in strategic studies. Over the last 4 decades, he's authored some of the foundational books and articles on strategy, the art of war, nuclear weapons, and hopefully the war in Ukraine. That's I'm revealing spilling some beans here. And aside from his very prolific academic activity, he was also in government service. He is the author of the official history of the Falkland campaign and was a member in the official inquiry of the Iraq War in Great Britain in the Iraq War. Among his many accolades and awards, we would cite only Fellow of the British Academy and Commander of the British Empire. And today, Professor Freedman will offer a few comments about the current state of war around the globe, and he will join by another luminary, the Caroline Munro Professor of Political Science, Scott Sagan, who's also a well-known authority on nuclear strategy and weapons. So with this, I will turn the mic to Sir Lawrence Freedman. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks very much. So when I arrived at San Francisco Airport, and after a long flight and an hour and a half standing in immigration, the guy who I thought really have got a very big backlog of people to get through started to ask me what I did. And I said, I'm a professor. I'm coming to give a lecture. Professor of what? War, I said. That was the wrong thing to say. And with all these people waiting behind, we got into a long discussion which involved us, well, how do you know these things? And the trouble is, it's a very difficult question to answer, because what I know from the same way a lot of you know it. I read the papers, I follow social media, but I've been doing it a long time, which is essentially my answer to him. So there's certain questions you ask when faced with a conflict about how it's likely to unfold, which doesn't lead you to be great at prediction. I don't claim to be great at prediction, but at least the issues that are going to be addressed, the things that have to be understood. And so the difficulty is, if you're a generalist professor of war, as opposed to a very specific regional expert, which I'm certainly not, then you find there's an awful lot going on. And just when you think, I've got a backlog of wars, another one comes along, and there's really too many. So, and the suggestion that I should talk about wars around the globe at the moment, where do you start? Because there's a number of wars going on at the moment that people don't talk about, particularly in Africa, Sudan, for example, Ethiopia, the Sahel. And I'm not going to talk about those, because although I have tried to get up to speed on Sudan and Ethiopia, I'm not as much up to speed as I am on Ukraine and the Middle East. We can talk about the Middle East and Gaza in questions. I'm going to concentrate on Ukraine. I'm hoping that yesterday's events will, for the moment, have removed the spectre of the massive Israel-Iranian war, which people were talking about not that long ago, that this seems to have de-escalated things rather than raised them to a new level. Gaza, it's in a pause at the moment while we wait to see what happens next, but that one will go on. But I'm going to concentrate on Ukraine because we're at a critical moment in Ukraine. tomorrow, as far as one can tell, but I won't believe it till it happens, the House will actually approve funding, which then has to go to the Senate and then has to go to the President. But this is a critical moment, because without it, Ukraine was in a very difficult position, still is in a very difficult position. With it, there's a chance to turn the situation round. So what I thought I'd do is, I think up to this point in these sort of talks, I've been, what happens with the supplemental, what happens without the supplemental. I'm just going to concentrate on with, because I'm so pessimistic for too long, so let's have a little bit more optimism about how this can shift things. So the current position, the Ukrainians, first, the questions one asks about war, one knows about war, is if a war's not over quickly, then it tends to go on. You don't often have medium-sized wars. You either have very short wars or quite long wars. If the initial push to have a decisive victory doesn't work, which is what Russia tried, and given the ability for Russia to adapt, which really began in September 22 to the Ukrainian pushback, this becomes a war of production and supply as much as for fast movement on the battlefield. Clausewitz observed a long time ago that the defense is stronger form of warfare than the offense, although you can't win with the defense, but if it's stronger, that's one reason why wars go on. And that's what happened. By and large, very few of the offensive operations that have taken place during the course of this war have succeeded. The Russians obviously made some progress in February 2022 to March, but not all of it could be sustained. The Ukrainians had a rather clever offensive in September 2022, and they took Kherson, a bit of Kherson, more of Kharkiv, but they haven't had a particularly successful offensive since. The Russians, people talk about the problems with the Ukrainian offensives, but the Russian offensives have been far more costly than the Ukrainian offensives, and have also not really made much difference to the line of contact. The war keeps on going on, thousands die, sometimes hundreds daily, but it doesn't actually move things along. Now, we appear to have reached a point where that could change, because Russia had the initiative, had the advantages in manpower, but particularly in munitions, and had developed tactics that were hurting the Ukrainians. The use of aircraft with glide bombs in particular. Ukraine had answers to these, but they weren't good enough. And so it was understood, even I think, even accepting that the more American assistance would come in, that this year was probably going to have to be one of holding the line as best as one could, while production capacities build up, and you start to think about how you could move things along, perhaps later this year, but more likely next year. But because of the delays, things have really got quite difficult. In some ways, it's surprising that Russia hasn't moved forward much more over the last few months. But again, although they have, they basically use brute force. They're not particularly sophisticated tactics. It involves throwing munitions at people at Ukrainian lines. And the Ukrainian lines have held quite well. But the Ukrainians have had basic problems. They're running out of manpower, and they're running out of munitions. Now, what happens if the supplemental passes? I think two things. First, they've already passed the bill that will allow more mobilization within Ukraine, which is desperately needed. Russia is a much larger country, it has more manpower, but that can be a bit misleading. You're not going to have millions fighting on both sides. But they definitely need more people. But if you're expecting to go to the front, where there's no munitions, not proper kit, it's hard to motivate people. So I think the passage of the supplemental will have a helpful effect there, add to the motivation. It'll also mean, once the Ukrainians are convinced that the reports are that the Americans are ready to go quite quickly, getting emergency supplies to Ukraine, is they don't have to husband resources quite so much. They can use what they have on the assumption that the stocks will be filled up. So I think that will have an immediate impact. The biggest issue, I think, is air defences. Europeans have been scrabbling around trying to help, and they've found some stuff. But as we saw the other day, it's pretty disheartening when you rebuilt an electricity transmission station and you've knocked out all the missiles that are coming to you until you run out of air defences, and the last three knock out the plant. So this is really quite urgent, and summer's coming up. It's not going to be as difficult as if this had happened at the start of winter, but it's not going to be an easy time. So I think in that sense we're looking to a period of where the defences will still stay stronger. So what does that mean in terms of how the fight develops? Well, first, it's one. I mean, I mentioned the Russian attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Clearly, there have been Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries. I think an important part of the Ukrainian strategy at the moment was to keep on demonstrating that they could hurt Russia in some ways, that they can make a position in Crimea more difficult. The attacks on the Black Sea Fleet have been quite remarkable, especially if they don't really have a navy. So the use of naval drones has been genuinely innovative. The use of drones altogether has been innovative. So they can, the fact that this seems like a deadlock doesn't mean to say it's obviously not pain-free for either side, and it continues. What does that mean, second question, about how this ends, which is the question one gets asked most, to which there's no satisfactory answer. If it is the case that the defence is stronger than the offence, it doesn't mean to say that, as you can see, that occasionally defences can't get overwhelmed, but it makes it very hard to win a decisive victory on the battlefield. My view from the start of this war is Russia can't win it, and that's still my view, because winning means subjugating Ukraine, and I don't see how they can do that, even less now than before. Never understood why they believed this country that could be occupied. So I don't think Russia can win, but there is a distinction between not winning and losing. Can Russia lose? Very difficult for Russia to lose. They can hang in there. This is a war economy now. They have got supplies of manpower. It's being mobilized for a long war. Putin, I don't think Putin wants a long war. I think Putin, like the Ukraine, would like this war over quickly and to win. But he has a very clear idea of what winning looks like, and it doesn't look like what he has at the moment, especially after he annexed 4 additional provinces in addition to Crimea. Unless he's got full control of those, then I don't think he will consider it a victory. And even then, he'd have the problem of a Western-oriented government in Kyiv that would be looking to join NATO, and he'd be, the basic problem I think he's got is he be in control of a chunk of land with a very long border with the rest of Ukraine, with quite a challenging internal security situation, which is full of unexploded ordnance, depopulated, its industries wrecked, its cities wrecked. This is not a great legacy, and it wouldn't be stable. It wouldn't be a particularly stable situation, which is why I think so much of the Russian views about peace is actually a deal with the Americans, in which somehow they would control what goes on in Kyiv. I don't think he's going to get any of that. So it's the Ukrainians expect a summer offensive that will try to tidy up the control of these 4 provinces as being the logical way for Putin to at least offer a ceasefire on that basis. I don't think it's easy for him to do so beforehand. So for the Ukrainians, the challenge is preventing that happening, and I think they can, if they, on the assumption that they can reorganize themselves with the new material coming in. So how does it end? I think it ends in Moscow. I don't see how it ends in Kyiv. If Putin offers a ceasefire, Zelensky will come under a lot of pressure to accept it. But Putin hasn't offered a ceasefire for the reasons I've given. I think it ends at some point out of a sense of futility. I think getting the idea that this will be sort of a 1918 conclusion to a long period of trench warfare is unlikely. It's not impossible, but I think it's unlikely. Again, you could see it more likely from the Russian side until now than the Ukrainian, but I think it's unlikely. The problem for Putin is is that this has been going on for 2 years, and he's got very little to show for it. And if this continues, and if he still has very little to show for it, at some point, the questions which are already there in Russia, people are not stupid, they know what's happened, will become louder and more important. And that, I think, it's not a prediction, and it's certainly no timescale attached to this. But I don't think one should underestimate it. If you think about wars the West has fought, it ends because of impatience, because it's frustrating, because it's been going on for too long. And we're not, and these where we weren't actually losing hundreds of people on a daily basis. So, I think this is potentially, therefore, a turning point in the story. Not that it will switch from Russian initiative to Ukrainian initiative in a matter of days, but it will blunt the Russian initiative. And if it blunts it sufficiently and the war carries on, then one should assume that at some point it becomes difficult for Putin to keep on arguing why it should continue. I'll close on one point, which is the point that people inevitably raise, which is the Trump point, as to what difference that makes. It's quite interesting to look at Putin's commentary on the possibility of Trump, in which he sounded less enthusiastic than one might imagine. And I think the reason for that is that Trump, who inevitably believes he will have the best peace deal possible in the first 4 hours of applying his deal-making capacity to it, what one knows of the plan that Putin has, which is not a surprising or a particularly original one, but would essentially consolidate the position of February 2022, give Russia Crimea, give Russia the Donbass, but not much else. It's not what Putin wants. It's actually more disruptive to Putin to have to push back on the Trump deal in some ways than to not have any proposals at all coming from the US because the US under Biden, because the US under Biden doesn't think it's up to them to make the deal. So I'm not wholly convinced by the view that all Putin is doing is waiting for Trump. I think Putin would like this war over quickly, and I think he believed that there was an opportunity with the Stall supplemental to get it. And if he fails to have done that over this period, then I don't think the assessments in Moscow will be altogether possible. But Putin doesn't want to be seen to lose. So on that point. Scott.
Great. Well, thanks. I told Amir that we should try to keep this conversational, and I wanted to start just by noting that I've known Lawrence Friedman since I was in graduate school, and he was a newly minted DPhil out of Oxford. And I've always admired both the breadth and depth of his knowledge, but also, most importantly, the independence of thought that he has displayed so often. My favorite scene in the movie Oppenheimer was when Oppenheimer walks in with a military uniform, and Arabi says, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, we've been asked to all join the military." And he said, "No, you should take off your uniform, be yourself, only better." And I think that is a metaphor for a problem that we have in the scholarly world as well. People put on uniforms. They follow trends. They do what everybody else is doing, and it ends up meaning our thinking sometimes is not independent. We don't really realize how much that happens. And I've always admired Lawrence Friedman for being independent. We saw a lot of that yesterday, and a lot of it today as well. I'm going to start just by making 3 observations where I would have a somewhat different interpretation or different prediction than you, get your reaction, and then have a conversation. I hope the people in the audience, especially the people who are trying to figure out what are they going to be writing about and thinking about in the future, ask questions about how to think independently and develop ideas in this field. So first, yesterday, he made the central point that the threats that Putin made repeatedly about nuclear use were primarily designed to deter NATO countries, especially the United States, from actively engaging in combat by reminding them that once you get into combat with Russian forces, there's a danger of escalation to nuclear weapons. I agree with that, but I would put more emphasis, even more than you did, with the one exception that you noted, which was in September 2022, when not only do we hear chatter from the military about potential use, Russian military about potential uses, but Putin himself said that there is a precedent for using nuclear weapons to end a war, citing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that suggested to me that at least he was thinking and trying to advertise the thought for coercive purposes that a use might not be a tactical use against a military target, but a strategic use against a Ukrainian city. I think that's important because I think that is one of the factors that got the United States and other NATO countries to be so concerned at that period of time. And I just want to note that that problem could reemerge if Russia's on the verge of losing, as you're suggesting. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we can to help Ukraine win, but it does mean we need to take that particular scenario really seriously. That's my point 1. Point 2, I think you're right that this war, it's hard to predict how this war will end, that a stalemate could make someone decide that it's futile. But wars end not only when leaders decide to change their minds and change their calculations, they also end sometimes when a government or people ends their leader, changes their leader. And I think you're right to say maybe the World War I analogy is not right, but I don't think we know of what kind of opposition there is to Putin in Russia today. It's very hard to predict this. There's polling. Catherine will have some comments on this, I think. We know that the military has gone along with lots of things that were against their doctrinal training, etc. But the Prigozhin incident, to me, suggested something that it makes it very hard. It's an example of how hard it is to predict how badly things can go wrong when a war's going badly. We don't know who he thought would support him when he got up to Moscow, whether he thought Putin might side with him, or who else in the Russian military would do that. It just reminds me of the oft-quoted statement when Khrushchev was overthrown, that Brzezinski, who was then still a professor at Columbia, was asked, well, how come you didn't predict that? They said, well, I didn't predict it, yes, but Khrushchev didn't predict it either. And so there's some modesty that we all have to have here, but I think that just reminds me of how little we know about threats to Putin. And then lastly, I wanted to make one comment to see how you would react to this about what happened yesterday in Iran. I think many people, when receiving the first news that there was an attack in Iran, especially at Isfahan, said, oh, the Israelis have gone after the nuclear program. Turns out not to be true, or at least as far as we know, not true. Much more modest attack than people had feared. But my own view is that while the 1981 Israeli attack on the Osirik reactor and the 2007 attack on the reactor being built in Syria were illegal acts under the laws of armed conflict, they were actually the right thing to do. And I'm really glad that Israel did that. Today, a major attack against Iran about its nuclear program, I think would fail, and that's the reason not to do it. Amos Yaglin, who was the actual pilot, retired as the Major General of Israeli intelligence, was here last year. He was actually the pilot who attacked the Osirik reactor. And he said that, had we done this a number of years ago, there may have been some chance of success, but now the likelihood that centrifuges are in multiple places, that there are backup systems, that we could delay it, but we can't prevent it. And the best way to prevent it is through diplomatic means. And I wanted to see whether you agreed with that assessment, because I agree with that assessment, but I feared the Israeli government last night did not. So those are my comments and questions.
Well, I agree with that assessment too. I mean, certainly couldn't do it without a lot of American support.
Right.
I think basically what the Israelis did yesterday was a sort of a mini version of what the Ukrainians had done earlier. So the problem with the Iranian attack is it was so large, it was hard to say, well, this is just a signal.
Right.
It seemed designed to hurt. It also had 120 ballistic missiles just to make a point. But it was also intended to make a point about the fact they have got a lot of missiles and they could send them in Israel's direction. I think because in the end that was ineffectual, Biden's line, take the win, I think was quite good, but it goes against every Israeli instinct not to retaliate in some way. For every tit there's got to be attacked. They did it, so well actually we'll just do a little one. It'll get through. Something got through.
And that in itself was a signal.
Yeah, right. And it makes it, and it's a sort of little signal that we can do more, but by not throwing lots at it, you didn't cause massive damage and keep this sort of thing going, which is not going to get either side anywhere in the end for the reasons you've given. So I think we agree on that. And that's why there's not a lot to be optimistic about in that part of the world, but on this thing, I think that probably ends this round. Oh, two other points. You're right, of course, on the second one about what things could happen to Putin. I guess my disposition is, and that's why I don't make predictions, is to start with, there was a lot about he's ill, he goes everywhere with 6 doctors, he may not last, he could be overthrown, and all of these things are possible. You don't know, but it seemed to me not things upon which one would wish to rely. The Prigozhin thing was astonishing when it happened. Prigozhin didn't expect to have got that far, I don't think. I think he was trying to protect his business model, which Shoigu was challenging by requiring all the Wagner people to be not private contractors, but to be part of the state. So I mean, he was furious with Shoigu, and I think he probably did hope that Putin somehow would side with him, though he misread it. If he ever thought that, Putin was never likely to do that. So off he went, and then all of a sudden found himself having launched a mutiny, which was more successful than he anticipated, and somehow allowed himself to be persuaded that everything could be forgiven and forgotten if he just went back, and obviously that didn't last. So, which is why next time I think they'll take, if anybody else tries it again. But there's not many people who could do that. So, a palace coup of some sort is not impossible, but it's not a thing upon which I would rely. So I think it's best to have a working assumption that it won't happen. Then working back to your, but it could. I mean, so it's not. And there clearly are tensions within the Russian elite and so on. We know there are. It would be extraordinary if there weren't. I mean, the poor people who have to keep the economy on the road, who've done an amazing job for Putin. The macroeconomic management of Russia is quite impressive in some ways, given what they keep doing. But it's getting harder. Interest rates are sky high, inflation's out of control. So there's issues. Anyway, on the first point, I think my concern with the escalation issue is it's a methodological one. That's very methodological questions. And the point I was trying to make yesterday was, don't start with your worst fears and work backwards to how it might happen. Start with the options that are actually available now, the developing situation. Of course, be aware, this is a nuclear power. The nuclear issue is always there. But, in September 22, I have a slightly, I know he mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but he's making points about the Americans, that we've got no right to lecture us on this sort of thing. You're the ones who use these things, not us. Okay. And the specific, this is not a bluff, section of that speech was clearly tied to NATO. So I didn't have that interpretation. I realised, we're all trying to make, I point out yesterday, we're all trying to make sense of this man's mind and how he thinks and works. But I think he was, as he often does, pointing out the hypocrisy of the West and so on, as much as anything else. But in September 22, he had other things he could do, and he did them. And they got him out of the hole that he was in at the time. I think they made the situation worse and far harder to resolve, partly because of the annexations. That, I think, was the most critical part of that decision. So it's not that we may not get to a point where Russia is losing and these issues come to the fore. But we're not there yet, and the danger is, and you can see this very much, I think, in the first months of after the Russian invasion, when it clearly thought they could get pushed out in this way was much stronger. That we get ahead of ourselves. That instead of saying, well, what are the options? What can Ukraine do now? What can Russia do now? If this happens, and then if that happens, then if that happens after that, then we're going to be in this terrible situation. And therefore, Ukraine, you really better do a deal now, because this is what's going to happen 5 stages ahead. And that, I think, was my concern. So of course be alive to all these possibilities, but look at the here and now. And that's my general view of strategy is we always expect strategy to start with your end point and how do you get there. It doesn't, it starts with the problem you've got to solve now. And Putin's problem in September 2022 is that he was being got at by his ultra-nationalists because of the incompetence with which the way the war had been fought. He'd been embarrassed by what had happened in Kharkiv. He'd been nagged by the military to mobilise and he'd been putting it off, and he decided he couldn't put it off anymore. And he was studying the whole thing when he put Sorokin in charge and so on. So that, it was a big thing. And he had to talk about nuclear weapons, but basically he reiterated the message of before: NATO, stay out.
I'd like to just open this up to questions and comments. Are you going to call on people?
Yes. Sarah.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation here. I was wondering.
Herb, why don't people introduce themselves? Because I know virtually everybody, but I'm not sure if where's who.
Herb Lynn, I'm with CSAC, and I do emerging technologies and the like. I was wondering if you could comment on the consequences of Putin being able to just declare victory at some point, having shown something, thereby setting the precedent of being able that a nuclear-armed nation can in fact invade a non-nuclear nation and get something out of it, which is a very bad precedent in my view. And I was wondering if you might comment on that.
Should we take a number or should I reply? I'm going to stand up actually because I'm going to talk to you, and I can't see the people at the back. So this question of why don't people just declare victory? Why doesn't Netanyahu declare victory? He should do, and then move to the next stage, which is a far more important stage than the one he's in at the moment, which is how do you reconstruct Gaza and so on. Why doesn't Putin declare the next stage? Because of the strategic problem that you'd be left with, I think, in part. And because, I think that Putin is cynical, but he believes this. He believes in this. He believes in this war. This is an extraordinary thing to have done, based on a misreading of 1,000 years of history, to suddenly decide to gobble up a neighbour, and then find yourself struggling. I don't think it's so easy just to declare victory. He's got to show at least it's an awful lot more than he could have got just by having a conversation in January 2022. So I don't think, yes, of course, if he has to agree to a ceasefire more or less on the current line of control, he'll find words to describe it. He can do that. He's got a propaganda outlet and so on. But I don't think he'll be satisfied. I think people, he's talked too much about this for people to suddenly sort of switch the narrative. It's not quite Stalinist times when they could, turn on us. I don't know what the American equivalent would be. We would say turn on a sixpence to change. That. Sorry, want to come back?
But no matter where he says stop, he has to be able to show something. They've got something, and that sets just a very bad precedent for the rest of the world.
No, it does. I agree with that, but it may not have any. It's Ukraine is not going to accept a long-term situation. I mean, they're not going to sign up to the loss of the Donbass or the loss of Crimea. They may accept a ceasefire, but they won't sign up to it, and that's part of Putin's problem. A peace negotiation is going to have to deal not only with this foreign affairs article about neutrality and security guarantees. It's going to be how do you unravel 16 layers of sanctions? What do you do about reparations? What do you do about war crimes? All of these things are there. You've got months and years of work. This war can't end with a peace treaty. You have a Versailles afterwards when you can talk about the detail. It'll end with a ceasefire, if it ends at all, or it'll peter out, because both sides are tired. Each year's offensive is a bit less than the one before, and so on. I mean, there's a variety of ways it can end. So I think I agree with you. It's quite important not to show that the aggression of this sort could prosper. I'm not sure, looking back at this as a precedent, lots of people are going to be saying, you know, crap, Putin, he really scored one there, didn't he? You know, I think they're going to be thinking this was an awful lot of price to pay for some battered and depopulated territory.
Thanks. Jim Golkar, visiting scholar here at CSAC. Thanks so much. It's great to have you here at Stanford, and thanks for the presentation. I want to follow Scott's point about the concern about escalation. So one of the issues that's arisen on the U.S. side is an effort to urge the Ukrainians not to attack targets inside of Russia, because of the U.S. fears of escalation. And our friend Eric Edelman had a really nice piece in the last couple of days in which he argued that this policy of the United States is here, I'm gonna read it because I think it was such a great quote. Policy of prohibiting Ukraine from doing what it needs to win for fear of Russian escalation is tactically unsound, strategically bankrupt, legally dubious, and morally squalid.
Well, that was sort of what I was arguing last night, but not quite in those terms. But, yeah. Is that a master comment on Eric's point? Sorry, did you want to carry on, Jim?
Well, I guess then going back to your earlier points about, and I'm sorry about missing last night, but your points about sort of Ukraine winning, losing, Russia winning, losing, does Ukraine have to take the war to Russia to achieve the goals that it would have in terms of pushing Russia back?
I think it probably does. I mean, I think it doesn't have to, you know, there's a difference between imagining that this war ends when, you know, Ukrainian forces are marching into Moscow. That's not going to happen. But so you know, there's a distinction between a Ukrainian invasion of Russia and Ukrainian hitting supply lines, supporting areas, and so on, to inhibit what Russia's doing in Ukraine. I mean, Eric's right. It's bonkers to say here's a country that is aggressing, that is occupying sovereign territory. But somehow its sovereignty must be totally respected in every way. Because even though it may make a lot of military sense, somehow it might upset people in Moscow, and they'll do a really silly thing. I mean, this is not a way, you're not going to start a nuclear war for this. It just doesn't make any sense. You're not going to achieve anything by doing that. One thing I did yesterday was to go through the reasons why it isn't a simple operational issue. So, you know, to go nuclear, there's a lot of big issues that would come to the fore, of which managing panic and alarm in Moscow, I would have thought, would be not a small part of it. So, I think if the Ukrainians had been deliberately targeting cities in Russia, that would have been a thing. And that would have produced some sort of retribution. But they haven't been doing that. They've been doing exactly what the Americans did, for example, in 1991 against Iraq, where they attacked dual-capable infrastructure in order to facilitate the ground attack that came later. It's no different. It's become back because it's a nuclear power. You've got to take more care, but that is not going to trigger nuclear use. And by going on about it so much, they made it more of an issue than it need be. I can understand sort of why the Americans feel it would be difficult if they were implicated in this, if American systems were being used for this purpose. But the Ukrainians have done pretty well developing their own systems. And you know, there'll be issues when the F-16s arrive, or hundreds of ATACMS that Speaker Johnson now thinks is a good idea to go. Maybe you know, the issues will arise that time. But I think this abundance of caution, to use a favoured phrase, has been really unhelpful. You know, you needed a strategic judgment. This is what I say about look at the here and now problem rather than think ahead. The here and now problem is how do you help Ukraine get a result out of this as quickly as possible? Instead, you sort of, you know, how will the Russian, you know, I think it's been really unfortunate. I mean, there's a lot good about American policy on this, you know, and I don't, in many ways Biden's done really well holding together the alliance, and so the last few months have been really difficult, but by and large he's done well. But this, I think, is an unfortunate part of the story.
I have a question. So I'm Saskolina, a business scholar from University of Białystok, Poland. And so what's the role and impact of hybrid warfare and non-kinetic operation combat on the war progress?
It's a really interesting one because you know, you look at all the literature up to February 2022, hybrid war and so on, and you know, cyber was, you know, you pull out the plug and all the lights go off and all the systems go down, and you win a bloodless victory. And Russia mounted a really massive cyber attack at the start of the war. And they didn't work. They didn't work because big tech companies, Elon Musk in a different guise to the one he has now with Starlink, but Microsoft quite importantly with patches, GCHQ in the UK, NSA here, they work pretty hard. Now, so this is a very good example of the danger of drawing lessons. Because the lesson you might draw from this is cyber attacks are not a means to support a big military operation. They were by the by. Well, if you don't have the support of NSA and GCHQ and Microsoft and so on, it might have been a much bigger deal. But it is a reminder that the problem with cyber attacks is you're never quite sure how well they'll work. So you can't wholly rely on them. And one of the problems with a lot of these attacks, we saw the US saying, you know, China has inserted itself into all sorts of places. So these Chinese intrusions are being watched. So the Chinese are, what does that mean? Does that mean they can't do anything about it, or they can do something about it, and you know, waiting for us to activate it and know how to go back? I mean, in UK, GCHQ and the police had a major coup where they sort of brought down a whole organised crime network that was trying to use cyber means. Well, they basically took it all down because they were able to watch and so on. So you don't know. It's not something on which you can rely. But I don't think one can draw conclusions from what happened in February 22 for other conflicts. Some very smart people came in to support Ukraine. Josh.
Yeah, Josh Kalanick, visiting scholar at CSAC and a U.S. Army officer. Kind of an extension then from Zoe's question, what does the situation in Ukraine say about the use of, sort of the efficacy of conventional military aggression in the 21st century? Because they were able to take significant portions of Ukraine over the past decade at very low cost, you know, with little green men. And in the U.S. military, we were studying, you know, Russian new generation warfare, as we were calling it. They have more terrain today, but the proportional cost to Russia has not been sort of
So you have to look at why did they make games? Those of 2014 and those in the south and east in February 2022. And it was subversion as much as conventional armed force. I mean, in 2014, the Ukrainian army was in a complete chaos. A lot of sympathizers with Russia. Russia had its own people in some of the key positions. And yet still, in the summer of 2022, the Ukrainian army was pushing back quite effectively against what we call separatists, but I mean they're Russian-sponsored separatists, Russian citizens separatists in many cases. And the regular Russian army then came in and gave the Ukrainian army a beating, which I'm sure was influential in their thinking in 2022. We did it before, we can do it again. We know that their plans for the full-scale invasion involved the FSB. They involved subversion, they involved having people who would basically let them in, which is what happened in Kherson. If you have a weak state or a weak region of the stronger state, then that tells you something about where you can have successful aggression or you can use armed force successfully. Israel in Gaza, the Israelis against Lebanon, 2006, struggled when they went in to fight Hezbollah. They looked at it. This time their tactics were different, pretty brutal, but they didn't lose the sort of numbers that people were expecting on the basis of what before, because they'd adapted their tactics in the process. So moving, again, it's the danger of drawing fixed lessons from these experiences, that there were very particular circumstances which favoured the Russians in the east and south, which they took advantage of. In Kiev, it worked against them. But even in Kiev, if the Ukrainians had waited another day in their preparations, it might have been a very different outcome. It wasn't, these things always look inevitable, but it wasn't inevitable that the Russians would get into quite the sort of mess they did. If the Russians had just taken the view, well, we might need some serious resistance, so what do we need to do if that happens, rather than charge forward with their full, their uniforms for the march past in Maiden, then they might have again been in a better position. So they got it wrong. So there are plenty of examples of conventional warfare since 1945. By and large, if you've got surprise and if you've got air superiority, you'll win. Russia, we thought, had those, but they didn't. I think there's an awful lot of complacency and hubris on the Russian side, which explains why, when they had an opportunity, they didn't take it.
Final question, Johan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Johan Zakharov here, visiting scholar at Greece. I wanted to ask what you think of President Macron's latest statement about sending troops. I mean, he doesn't kind of exclude sending troops to Ukraine. You mentioned that also yesterday that the NATO states they should more focus on options and not just nuclear fear. So, strategically speaking, what are the other more options, not only besides sending weapons, but to something, sending troops, something others, training in Ukraine, not in UK, and so on? Thank you.
So, you know, any European, especially a Brit, takes great care when trying to interpret President Macron's utterances. But I think he was reflecting a real concern. And the concern goes more or less like this. We have all, in Europe, committed ourselves to Ukraine's defense. I mean, it has been quite impressive. The Ukraine fatigue that everybody was talking about didn't set in. Money has been found, the weapons delivered. We're just not, don't have the arsenals and the capabilities that the Americans have, because we're a lot of different nations rather than one very powerful one that sees itself as a superpower. So we've done what we can, we've committed ourselves, but what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic? The money's being held up, and it may never happen. Let's look at what Trump is saying. We really have to take more responsibility. Now, Macron, who has argued for years, as do many of his predecessors in the Elysee, that Europe needs to do more for its own defence, strategic autonomy is his phrase, is more inclined to that message than many others who really don't want the Americans to go away, believe much more strongly in NATO. But that's part of it, that you've got a real strategic issue here. The most serious security crisis Europe has faced for decades, arguably since 45, certainly since 61, the Berlin crisis. So, if you take the position that it's up to us and we can't let Ukraine lose, and the Russians look like they may have the initiative, then you're allowed some original thinking. And this was his idea. He didn't really prepare the ground particularly, but Chancellor Scholz, with whom he's not on the best of terms, was not happy. But I don't think he was wrong to raise it, because, and it comes back to this basic point about how escalation happens and how options develop. What is the problem you face at the time? Now, if it said we must send troops in now, premature, we don't need to do it. But to point out that at some point these sort of issues may have to be addressed is not unreasonable, fraught though they would be. So I think that's what he was trying to do. Hopefully, some of that pressure will now ease, but I don't want to get too far ahead. Let's see what happens over the next month or so. There's another point which goes back to just this part of the challenge and sort of what distinguishes an original strategist, if you like, in government. People who write about it, actually somebody who's got to make the decisions, is to find ways of presenting these issues that reduce the risks of things getting out of hand, while accepting that you have to address the core challenge which you face, which is Russian aggression. And if Russia did walk through Ukraine, you ain't seen nothing in terms of the alarm and panic that would then be generated in the Baltic states and elsewhere. So there are things that you might want to do. So Poland, if Poland decided that as a bilateral issue, it should put troops into Ukraine, but not on behalf of NATO, but on behalf of Poland, what happens then? That's a perfectly plausible response, which the Poles have talked about. I don't think it does any harm. Just as we have the sort of speculative discussions about things that Russia might do, they should start having speculative discussions in Moscow about the things that European countries might do and NATO might do, just to make them realise that they're running risks as well. That's part of my, goes back to this question about the American determination not to alarm the Russians. They need to be a little bit alarmed. because they're running high risks with what they're doing. So that's why, you know, that would be my overall take on Macron. It would be good if Macron followed up. I mean, the bizarre thing about this is, you know, Scholz appears as the one who's most hesitant, not giving them tourists and so on. But Germany's doing a massive amount for Ukraine, far more than France is at the moment. You know, it'd be quite helpful if Macron followed up a little bit on with a bit more material support. I mean, they've done so. You know, come on, one has to be grateful for what one gets. But you know, Germany's done masses actually. UK's done quite a lot. The Poles, Czech. I mean, it's an impressive response. It just doesn't have the critical mass that the Americans could bring.
Our conversation today and the lecture yesterday will be posted online, so you'll be able to revisit and circulate and proselytize it. Thank you so much, both of you. Scott,